Good afternoon. I'm Bill Young from Flatirons Solutions. Some work that we did for a recent customer around Dashlet for a workflow dashboard that they desired. If you sat in on Kevin's or Dave Draper's talks over the last couple of days, this is not in 4.2. It's not using the new capabilities, but as they've told you, it's all backward compatible. So just a quick overview of what I'll discuss today. I'll start off with some justification, basically the customer's case that they presented to us that they wanted developed, and then a little bit about the analysis that we did in deciding what approach we wanted to take for this, and then we'll walk through the solution, and you'll see a lot of the details of what we did. So first, in terms of the justification, or what the customer's problem was that they wanted us to solve. Come on, don't do that. All right. They wanted an overview. What do you need?
Can you brighten your screen?
Well, that's what he was trying to do. I mean, I can brighten my screen and it has no impact there.
Okay.
Yeah, he was trying to brighten it up and it wasn't working. Or is that for the feed for the recording? Oh, okay. Well, I'll try that. Okay. So how many of you have worked with workflows within Share and are familiar with the workflow interfaces that exist? Not too much. Okay, a few of you. All right, so the customer looked at what was available there with my tasks and workflows I've started and so forth, and they found it lacking. They wanted to get an overview of all of the workflows, and their use case is very long-running processes. So we're managing some long-running batch-oriented automated processes within the workflow, as well as some occasional user tasks to direct the processing. So they wanted to see what the state of the workflows were in a dashboard, to all the active workflows where you could see what automated processes were running, as well as any of the user tasks that were waiting to be picked up and handled. The details that were provided are scattered across some different pages, and they wanted some additional detail that was not readily available there that they had to dig a little bit deeper for. Key for them was a single point of control. They didn't want to have to train the users on all of these multiple places to go to be able to pick up information about workflow. So they wanted a single place where the users would be able to see that list, would be able to go into the task edit screen, and would also be able to view the current state of the workflow and possibly even control some of those long-running processes. Nice tabular representation was what they had asked for, so that they had just columns that were sortable, filterable, showing the different categories of information that they wanted. So I mentioned the column ordering and the filtering there within those tables. So some of the details about the workflows that they wanted to show were a workflow type. They have a few different styles of workflow that they want to be able to run, a few custom workflows that they've designed. So they want to know what type each workflow is. They want to know what the state of the current task for that workflow is. Want to see that for each of the workflows, what the current task is and what its status is. And who the owner of the task is. If it's a user task that's been claimed, they want to know who that owner is, who currently has ownership of that. They also wanted to see the start date and time of the tasks. So if it's a user task, when it was claimed by the user. If it's one of these long-running automated tasks, when that task started running. Get an idea of how long it may have to go. From that same screen, they also wanted to be able to bring up the workflow diagram. If you've worked with the workflows, you know in the workflows I've started screen, there's a link there, there's a button for bringing up the workflow diagram and seeing where in the workflow you currently are, and we'll see an example of that. So we took these requirements, took what they wanted to see in this dashboard, and we took a look at what was available to us out of the box. And basically we had the workflows I've started and the My Tasks as the two primary places that had most of this information. And that's the problem. The out-of-the-box features show this information on different screens. They wanted a one-stop shop. Some of the things that they wanted to see, like the workflow type, weren't readily available. So we decided that a custom Dashlet was one possible approach. So to develop a custom Dashlet for them. Or maybe we could modify My Tasks somehow, because that had probably 2/3 of what they wanted to see. But in looking at this, My Tasks was insufficient, wasn't tabular, didn't provide the filtering, and so forth. So we came down to coming up with a custom Dashlet. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the solution and spend the bulk of the time here today going into that. So the first thing that I'll do is show you a finished snapshot of what we came up with for the Dashlet. You know, I looked at this and I said, well, do I want to go through and do mock-ups and all of that? I said, nah, I'll just show you the finished, and then we'll go back in and see how we got there. We'll look at the actual Dashlet definition. And how many have done Dashlet construction, building your own custom Dashlets? Okay, even fewer. All right. This is not going to be a how to write Dashlets. I'm just going to give you some ideas of how we got there, and you can fill in some of the blanks down the road. We'll talk about the Java web script that backs the Dashlet, that backs getting the information for this Dashlet. And we'll go into the JavaScript and what technology choices we made for building that the Dashlet. So here's our screenshot, and just a few things to point out here. We have, as I said, what the customer really wanted was a one-stop shop that their users would use to manage workflows in total, start to finish. So we have we have the different workflow types listed up there at the top, in the top row just below the workflow status title. And then we have our table of information here. You know, we have the type of the workflow, we have the current task description. These are some of the different actions that can be taken, and I'll talk in detail about those when we get into the demo. Who the initiator of the workflow is. We have the owner of the workflow listed over here, or the state. So for a user task, it's going to be the owner. For an automated task, it'll be the state, whether it's running, queued, aborted, failed, whatever. Work package is a name for the workflow, for the individual instance of the workflow. And then we have the timing information. The count for these batch processes is used to help understand how long that workflow is going to take to complete, because these are, for my simple examples, I only have I've got the one up there that's in the 34,000 document range. So these workflows are processing a large number of documents in many cases. You see some filtering capabilities on here. How many of these workflows I'm going to show. Right now I'm showing all 11 that were in my development system when I took this snapshot. You have paging capabilities through those, and then there's a search capability to search across the columns here. In addition, there are capabilities to filter the columns themselves, and we'll actually see those in the demo. So, typical Dashlet template definition. We have the handful of files. The few of you that were also in Kevin's presentation saw this same list. And they're probably familiar to you if you've done any amount of this. The first one is the description. Just a descriptor for the Dashlet, gives us the name and how it's going to be accessed. excuse me, some header information about the libraries that we'll be using, the actual HTML definition, and what you'll see here is ours is pretty simple, not quite as simple as Kevin's. Some JavaScript for doing the initialization of the Dashlet, and then our internationalization, our properties file. Our description, that's pretty basic. You know, just tell what we're doing and give ourselves our URL that we're going to be using to access that. Key things to notice here in the head. You know, first of all, as you have in any Dashlet, you're going to include the Alfresco components. And then we had a couple of things that we specifically needed to include in here. One are the workflow actions definitions that are used in Workflows I've Started screen and in the My Task screens. So we needed to be able to reuse those instead of reinventing them. So we include that. And then the table, we actually used the jQuery data tables. So we've actually blended some YUI with some jQuery to construct this Dashlet. And then, of course, our own custom code for the controller for the Dashlet. The HTML is really quite simple. We're really going to be just grabbing the initial bit of information to kick off the Dashlet, and then we have a couple of divisions here identified. The first one right here is just a loading page. As you can imagine, if you have dozens of these workflows running, it could take a little while, so we've got a little nice spinning icon there. You'll see that. And then we basically just have a placeholder, and the controller is actually going to fill that in because of what we're using, because of the jQuery data tables. We're just putting that placeholder in there. We'll build the model and then inject it in during page build time with the JavaScript. Okay. So next thing I want to talk about, I skipped over a couple of the files. I didn't go into the JavaScript file or the properties files. They're pretty standard, pretty straightforward, nothing very exciting in those at all. So next thing I want to go into is some of the Java code that goes behind this, because that's really where almost all the heavy lifting is being done. The rest is just connecting up some JavaScript and libraries and laying out the rows of the table. All right, so if you have done, okay, I asked about Dashlet. How many have done WebScript development? Maybe the same list? Yeah, okay, about the same. All right, so we're of course going to start from the Alfresco abstract WebScript, and we had a couple of different workflow-oriented WebScripts that we developed. So we had one abstract which basically encapsulated some of the information that we needed among all of our WebScripts that we have. All right, and then this is actually our custom Java WebScript, which makes use of a helper over here to actually build up the JSON that gets sent back down to the page, and then, of course, the standard WebScript request and response objects. So very simply, our second level in the previous diagram, abstract workflow WebScript that we defined, we're going to need the service registry, and we just use that to get the workflow service so that we can actually go retrieve information about the workflows and the tasks. And then in order to help ourselves with the performance of this, we went ahead and cached some of the information. A lot of the workflow information is quite static. So we can cache that, set a reasonable lifetime, and we just use cache, which comes with Alfresco. The rest of the code for this abstract class is just the getters and setters for that. We also, at this level, just wrote the execute because it's going to do effectively the same thing regardless of what our destination is ends up being. We really just want to build up a JSON response and send it back. So we just implemented the execute in the abstract class, and we're going to have our model builder, whatever model builder we decide to implement for that particular case, and we'll send back the response. All right, so a little bit about the model builder because that's really where the heavy lifting goes. Again, we have an abstract that handles a lot of the work. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about any of that, but this handles a lot of the work of gathering the information using the workflow service, finding out about the individual workflow instances, what tasks are active, what paths are active, and so forth. So we're getting information on, from the workflow service on workflow instances. Concrete class, it's also going to be using node service to get information about the folder, the workflow package, and we have some additional pieces of information in there, like the number of articles that are in the package, things of that sort. And as I mentioned, the workflow task and workflow paths are also providing us information that's displayed in the columns. So our interface really is just simply the get JSON response. That's the call that you saw in the execute method, so nothing too stellar about that. We're basically just going to build up a data array. Now the reason we're building up an array is we really have two pieces of information that we're going to be sending back. One is that workflow table data, the data that's actually going to go into the table. We also send back user preference information. So we're storing back to the repository the user's preferences on what filtering they want on the page, what items they have, how many items they want to display, and so forth. So the whole data array is actually what's going to be doing the bulk of the work. And here it is. Now, of course, I've left out a lot of the details. So we're going to build up a map of maps, in effect. So the map of maps is going to basically be keyed on the workflow instance. And then within the workflow instance, we can have multiple values that we're going to store. And then we're going to get that and convert it into the JSON. So for each of the workflows that we process, each of the workflows that we get from the workflow service, and that's what this call is doing, getting the active workflows from the workflow service, and then we build up the map. We're going to process each of the task entries for the workflow. Now, generally, you would expect only one task entry. That's not always the case. There's a little bit of a timing issue. If a user has moved a task along, there is some period of time where the user task that they were in, let's say, and the automated task are both showing as active simultaneously. So we have to resolve that somehow. So that's why we have the iteration there on the tasks. And then we're going to just build up the JSON out of the details that we've pulled for each of the workflow instances and tasks. And here's an example of the JSON response that we're going to get back. So I have the workflow name here, and this is actually the identifier that comes out of our workflow definition. So this doesn't look anything like what we saw in the table. We do a translation through the properties files based on the name that's provided here. Similarly with the task name. You didn't see that task name shown. Again, you saw a translation through property definitions. The username of the workflow owner, the initiator of the work, or I'm sorry, the task owner, The is pooled is related to whether it's a group-oriented task or whether it's an individual assigned task, and that becomes important when we look at the actions. And I'll take a look at that in a bit. And then who the workflow owner is, and the workflow name, the count information, the date information. Along this line, this is our status, our state of the workflow, the is executing or is queued or is failed. And that's what we use to help guide what goes into that status column if it's an automated task. So fairly simple, straightforward structure that we get back. And then in the JavaScript, we're going to have to pull these pieces apart and figure out the display and lay them out into the columns. I said there was a second piece of information, the user's preferences. Here's the JSON for this, not the topic of this talk, but just to show what we're getting back there. So those are the two array components that we get back. So as I mentioned, our JavaScript is a combination of YUI and jQuery. We just use the boilerplate YUI for Dashlets, and then we add in the jQuery table building, the data table building, where we need it. So these couple of screens just show the basic definition, the initialization that gets done. And then here is our, just our constructor. Nothing very stunning here. Again, we just have to define the components that we're going to use. Buttons, containers, data table, and so forth. All right, so options that we pass in. We really had only one option, which was a default value for a maximum number of items to display in the table. All right. So here's where the real fun starts. When the page is ready, we fire the onReady event, as typically exists in the YUI code, and we do a couple of initial setup pieces here. These first three calls that are done are all related to the preference updates and how we trigger an update back into the server. So if the user clicks on any of particular locations within the table, so if they change, for example, in here, if they change the filters, that's going to fire off an event to update their preferences back to the server. If they type in some kind of property, if they update the number of items in the table, that's all those lines do. Here's really the building of the data table itself. So, of course, we're doing an AJAX call back to that web script, and you'll see the name that we had declared for the web script in the web script descriptor. And we provide the name of the user, which is going to give us back some of the status information that we need to know about that user related to that workflow. Back up. So on success, we have a lot of things that go on here in building the table. So I've just separated that out. And then, of course, we have a failure callback as well. So this is our success callback, or a portion of it. We pull off the preferences information, we pull off the workflow data, and we're just going to iterate over each of the items that are in each of the workflow rows, effectively, that are in that JSON. That's just going to be an array as well, an array of workflows. And I've abstracted out the information here. We construct the workflow type, as I mentioned, by taking that string and doing a lookup out of the properties. Similarly, for the task, we're going to do something very close to that. The actions are relatively static, except that given the state of the task, certain action may have to be disabled or enabled. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we walk through the demo. That's just the user's name. It just gets put together. The work package name also just gets extracted. The count information, similarly, claimant or the owner or the state. So that requires a little bit of work here. We actually just have a separate function that pulls that information together based on whether it's an automated task or manual, and then the time. So we're really just constructing the row from building up those data components, building up each one of those cells. And the actual building of those cells is not really all that exciting or that stunning, but this is how we have to build up the rows and then put them into the table. So we just inject those into a table that we're constructing, and then we have to hand that table off to the jQuery. And that's what we'll see here in just a bit. Actually, you see part of it here. We populate the table building this, so we just inject it by ID that we saw in the HTML.ftl. And then this is the jQuery to say, treat this as a data table. So the next screen shows a little bit about how the jQuery data table works, how you specify certain things about it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because that's really kind of boilerplate stuff that just you have to do with any jQuery data table. Pardon me. You specify information about each one of the columns as far as whether it's going to be orderable, whether it's a sortable column, what type of data you're going to get, what it should be treated as. In this case, we're saying that second column, which is the task, is HTML. The type of, whether you've got a selector, a drop-down, or whether you've just got plain text, and so forth. This is our selector for the number of items in the table, the number of rows in the table. And that's about it that's really of any great interest there. If you want more information on that, you can go look at the jQuery data table definition. But that's really it. Once we've injected the table itself that we constructed on the previous page, and we do this setup, that's it. That's the extent of the code. So, at this point, flip over to do a demo. Up on the website, up on the Summit website where you can download the presentations, I have a PowerPoint with slides only without the demo, and then I have one with the demo embedded. But for now, what I'm going to do is flip over to the demo running separately just in Windows Media Player because it allows me a little bit better control. Wow. Let's see, can I? That's not much better. Okay. So before I start this, again, this was the screen that we saw before. I want to point out just a couple of things here. The actions, I keep deferring much discussion on that. This is our edit task action. Same kind of icon that you'll see in the My Tasks. Boy, that's really unclear. The gear here is the workflow diagram button, same button that's used in the other screens. And then this X here for a queued item allows us to remove it off the queue before it's actually started processing. And that's a separate talk, how we did the queuing and the management of those. That's my talk at 5:30, so if you're interested in that. In this particular case, it's grayed out because it's running, so we're not going to dequeue it when it's in the middle of running. Okay, so let's go ahead and start on this. Some of these aspects I've talked about. We'll log in this user. So I've got two different users I'll be using, Patrick Moan and myself, just to show different features here. First of all, the default that we've set up for this customer is just this one Dashlet on their on their share page. And that's all they really want their users using. And we've cut out a whole batch of menu things. This could be an optional Dashlet, but in our particular case, we've made that it. You'll notice we don't have the normal share menus. We've ripped out a whole batch of things up there along the upper left. We talked about, real briefly, the different workflow styles that are available. The selector for the number of items, I showed that before as well. This demo goes about 5 minutes, and then that's pretty much the end. So we'll have plenty of time for questions, I think. So you saw this in the JavaScript that we had 10, 25, 50, and 100, or all in the definition there. That's part of the data table definition. The search capability I mentioned, this search works across all columns of the table. So notice right here I've typed in a P and not changed anything. Now I've typed in PA, and I'm going to just hold that here. And you see what we've matched here is a PA over here in this name, package. We've also matched PA in Patrick's name. But we lost several of the other items that didn't have a PA anywhere in any of the columns. Now if I continue typing, and I put a T in there as well, you'll see that now I've filtered out. I no longer have package. All I'm matching on now is PAT and Patrick. So that's one way to do filtering, and that goes across all of the columns. We can also do filtering on individual columns. So we could, if I wanted to filter on the initiator, I could just pull down the initiator's name here and get Patrick that way too. Filter on the workflow type. And these are all populated by the data table based on the actual values in here, the actual values that are in the table. Same thing with the task description, and this is an interesting one to look at. So you saw in the JavaScript that I had specified the type of this column as HTML. And what we did was we were asked by the customer to add this little bit of historical information, which is part of what comes back in the JSON. I didn't show that, but it's there. And we wanted it formatted nicely, so we made this an HTML column so that we could put a line break in here. The one slightly unfortunate thing about that is that in the filtering, it treats the whole thing. It strips out the HTML tags, and it just treats the whole thing as the text. So we're not filtering just on the actual task name. We're filtering on that whole string, and that's what you see shown here. Just a little, minor gotcha that we had to deal with, but it didn't end up being anything significant. All right. So we see the two initiators there, and that gets us the same list that we had when we type PAT. In this particular case, because we have potentially dozens of these workflows, it didn't really make sense to have a drop-down layer there for selection, but maybe the user has a particular scheme that they use for naming their workflows, so they could type in free text there, the search capability. All right. So, did I miss it? No, okay. Let's see if I can back up to that and show that. Catch it that time? Okay. So in this column, again, I mentioned that we have the mix of information here. We have the owner of the task for a user task. So what we see here is Bill Young has at least one task claimed somewhere in here, but Patrick doesn't have any task that he has claimed. So again, the values here are based on what's actually populated. We could have queued, we could have running, we could have unclaimed. For manual tasks, it'll be unclaimed. We could have failed. There are a couple of other potential states in there as well. And notice as we move on here that the filters accumulate, and in this case, Patrick didn't have any workflow that he had initiated that's in the running state. So he actually filtered out everything. We have column sorting. So you see the sort order change here by clicking on that. All provided by the data table just by that definition that we saw in the JavaScript. So I'm going to log in as myself now, and we'll see a couple of things here. This is my default setting. So I've said I want to see all workflows, but only the ones that I own. I really don't care about anything else. And my default setting is this sort order where the most recent action is at the top. All right, so this is the workflow diagram. All right, don't worry about what all's going on over here. Not a big deal. But if you haven't seen this before, this is a nice view for the users to see just where in the workflow they are at the current point in time. They don't see the history, they don't see a path, but they can see where we are right now. So in this particular case, that workflow that I pulled up the diagram for, we're in the middle of ingesting those 34,000 documents. Okay. Because the task is already running, this is disabled, as I mentioned before. I can't dequeue that item. But the one below is queued. It hasn't started running yet, so I do have that option to dequeue that. I'm not going to go into details on that, but this is where we're taking the information that's coming back in the JSON on the state of the task and determining what the state of our actions are. All right, and yeah. So another little bit here. We'll take a look at the tasks. This is the edit task. Notice that these two tasks I've claimed. I can go into the edit task for those two tasks or for these unclaimed tasks. There's no user task, so it doesn't make sense to have an edit task button here or an edit task action. Okay, we'll let that run for a little bit more. So again, those buttons make use of the workflow actions library that I talked about that's linked in to take us right to the edit task screen. Now, not very exciting. That's, just shows the next step after an ingestion where I'd end up. It's where the user makes the choice of the routing. So the next thing that we'll do is we'll log off and log back in as Patrick, and we'll look at the difference in the tasks that are shown. And that should conclude the demo. So you see when I log in as Patrick and I open up all, or I go filter just on mine, you'll see Patrick cannot go into the edit task screen there. Again, the state information that we provided with the with that workflow information JSON. Okay. All right. So there were a number of other considerations that we had to take into account here. I've mentioned the user preferences. That was just an ability to control what's always going to be shown by default each time the user logs in. Table load time was significant. This user has some cases where they have on the order of 100, 150 workflows that are in progress, different packages of documents that they're going to need to be loading over the course of a couple of weeks of time. You can imagine if we have to go out to the workflow service and pull that information in every time, that could take a good deal of time. For these long-running tasks, again, going out and pulling that information from the workflow service as well. The workflow information is pretty static. You always know who the initiator is. The name doesn't change. The work package name doesn't change. That's static information that you can just cache. So we did cache all of that with a relatively long lifespan of, I think we've got it set about a week right now, which seems to be working for them because these processes will run a few hours and then they'll pick it up and do a couple of days of review and so forth. So the workflow information we can cache for a long time. The task information, on the other hand, we don't want to cache for quite as long because those tasks, the long-running tasks, will go for a couple of hours, maybe 6 hours at the longest on some of them. So we want those to expire. So we've got different times for expiration of that information. So we did all of that with the Hcache. That was a huge issue for the customer. You know, of course, in development and QA, and we didn't have 150 workflows running. Loaded up fast for us. The data table column width management was a big issue for us. And part of that is because we're embedding within Share. There's a lot of CSS that gets loaded. If you've ever tried to trace through that, there are a bunch of style sheets that get picked up. And there's a lot of inheritance of information, such as the column widths. So it was actually overriding what jQuery was trying to do. And it took quite a bit of digging. And a couple of talks ago, there was some, Dave Webster gave a talk on doing some debugging. And yeah, I could have used seeing some of that a little bit earlier. It took quite a bit. We actually ended up having to write a special class that we embedded into our cells so that we could drive very specifically what the column widths were, because the core or the base CSS in Share is very specific, right down to, you know, table, tbody, tr, td, etc. And that was getting picked up ahead of everything else that we had. And jQuery the jQuery data tables do try to do a smart sizing of the columns if you tell it to, and you can guide it in certain respects. But yeah, Share was getting in the way of us for that. So other than that, this has been pretty well accepted by the customer, and I'm hoping that at some point in time I need to talk to folks back at Flatirons. We can maybe provide you know, some full code and some simplified examples of how we did this. Just want to give credit where credit's due. I didn't do the bulk of the development. As I mentioned at the outset, I'm a tech lead and architect, but I did help Sri in the initial design of this as we sat down with the customer, and then he did the bulk of the development and the integration of the data tables, and April did the work on the user preferences. And with that, are there any questions? And if you do have any, please let Eric run on up with the microphone for you. One behind you, Eric.
Is this now available as a commercial product that we can purchase from your company and deploy on our own systems?
No, it is not. This was custom developed for a customer. We're a system integrator, so it was a custom solution for them. But what I'm hoping is that we'll be able to package this up and either contribute it or, you know, make it available some other way.
Just a minor thing, I may have missed it. What about workflows that have already completed? Are they going to be listed? Can you go back?
No, they're not listed if they've been completed.
And so they'll go away?
They go away, yeah.
They go away.
I mean, the business case that this customer had, once they've finished, all of the information gets archived and they have access to it, but it's not through this dashboard.
How much work would it take to display historical workflow data if you were to take that to the next step and maybe it's a secondary dashboard or something like that, so that any business user can go in and see, for instance, a compliance officer who wants to see when a compliance document was approved, and by whom? How much extra work would that be?
Extra work? I imagine that it would depend on what the archiving mechanism was that you took. Because effectively, once the workflows finish, you don't have that information on the workflow available from the workflow service anymore. It's done. All those tables are cleared. So you have to do something in your data model to capture whatever information is important to you and store that away. Now, the workflow package is still available within the repository. It's just not easy to get to. You know, you don't have a direct path to it, so you have to come up with some means of being able to do that. And we've done that. We actually have, we captured the information in a separate folder that contains almost all of the metadata that was shown there. You know, the initiator, the workflow description name, all of that, the history, what steps were taken within the workflow, all of that we capture and we store as metadata on a folder that also has links to all of the content that was brought in. So, given that, we could easily write a web script that extracted that metadata and made that available in a dashboard. It was a little bit of a how, but you know, it wouldn't be any more difficult than what I showed today.
I'm not trying to second guess or anything, but a lot of times I want to know this kind of information because I'm having performance issues. So what, you know, there's nothing that weights it, that says, you know, this is the real killer, or this is one that's exceeding its parameters, time-wise, or anything like that.
We don't have any of that information built in here. The closest thing that we have is that count information. So a user can get an idea of how long their particular processes are taking. The count had two values, 0, / and then 34,000, whatever. So that would give the user some indication of how rapidly it's finishing, but not a weighting, not a which of these is consuming more resources or anything like that. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much.